You might think gladiator games were about glory, death, and roaring crowds, but they were also about paperwork, ledgers, and logistical nightmares. Beneath the blood-spattered sand of the Colosseum lay an intricate web of bureaucracy that kept the deadly show running. Let's begin not with a blade, but with a spreadsheet or its Roman equivalent. Gladiator games, or Munera, began as private obligations, wealthy elites offering blood sports as gifts to the people during funerals. Over time, these gifts became expectations, and by the height of the Roman Empire, the games had transformed into state-sponsored spectacles. Hosting them wasn't optional anymore. It was a duty and a political move. Magistrates were required to provide games, and doing so poorly could ruin a career. Organizing a successful ludus wasn't about guts. It was about efficient supply chains and reliable accounting. A Roman editor, sponsor of the games, had a mountain of mundane problems. How many beasts to order? How many gladiators are available and in what fighting condition? How many trainers, doctors, armorers, cooks, and handlers are needed? How much grain, oil, and water would be consumed in a single week of games? All of this had to be balanced against the treasury. Gladiator schools, ludi, were businesses. They had assets, human and animal. A gladiator had an appraised value, and paperwork documented injuries, deaths, and transfers between schools. Picture a clerk in tunic and sandals, hunched over a wax tablet, noting Secundus, Thracian style, dislocated shoulder out for 3 weeks, value reduced by 10 denarii. Weapons had to be tracked like military stock. Every trident, net, gladius, and scutum was logged. Armor was reused and patched, passed down from one combatant to another. Trainers were responsible for maintenance, but a separate team of armament often oversaw larger inventories. They kept supply rooms locked and rotated gear to prevent rust or theft. Lost equipment meant penalties, or worse, especially if a poorly armed gladiator died due to a faulty helmet. The Colosseum wasn't just a stage, it was a government-funded machine where failure in one cog could bring chaos. The detailed records that survived in fragments tell us of weapon requisitions, food orders, logistics for crowd control, and even urine purchases used in cleaning gladiator uniforms. Gladiators weren't all slaves. Many were octorati, free men who signed contracts to fight for money, fame, or debt relief. Their contracts resembled modern sports agreements, except they could die in the ring. The contract detailed number of years, or fights payout bonuses for survival medical coverage. Yes, there was a form of this food and housing provisions penalties. For desertion, usually fatal. Slaves, of course, didn't sign anything. They were property. But even slaves were insured. Owners who lent their gladiators to the games were compensated if the fighter died, at a value determined by official assessors. Human resources was a bloody business. Training schools, like the Ludus Magnus, were part military barracks, part prison, and part training facility. Gladiators trained daily, often on wooden weapons. Meals were high-curd, mostly barley porridge, to bulk up the body and form a protective layer of fat. This fat could slow bleeding from shallow wounds, making fighters more durable and more entertaining. Schedules were recorded: morning drills, noon sparring, matches, evening conditioning, physician checkups, and yes, Even Roman doctors kept medical logs. Trainers, doctors reported daily performance. Injuries were tracked. A gladiator who underperformed might face extra punishment or reduced rations. Some schools even used performance-based incentives. Gladiator training wasn't a chaotic, wild preparation for death. It was an administrative marathon. Paperwork dictated everything from food portions to wound salves. Cleanliness mattered. Dirty arenas led to infections, and a foul-smelling venue upset the crowd. Oil was used for skin conditioning and then scraped off with the collected sweat and oil mix called gladiator oil was sold as an aphrodisiac or health tonic. Who managed this process? Slaves and attendants specialized in grooming, cleaning, and even corpse disposal. Dead fighters were dragged away by masked Karen impersonators and carted off to designated burial areas. But before burial, someone had to file the death, update the inventory, and alert the sponsor for compensation. Imagine dying in glorious battleland, becoming a line item on a ledger. As games became more grandiose, emperors like Commodus and Trajan turned them into political weapons. Commodus personally fought in the arena, but his participation was staged and heavily guarded. His appearances required extensive planning, stage management, and script writing. Emperors had teams of scribes, orators, and stage designers, ensuring every game sent the right message. Rome is powerful. Rome is eternal. Rome feeds its people living with blood. But what happens when things go wrong? What if the beasts die in transit? What if the crowd revolts due to poor food distribution? What if a famous gladiator refuses to fight? Contingency plans existed. Replacement acts were scheduled. Musicians and dancers could be sent in to buy time. Civil guards stood, ready to quash uprisings. Even failure had to be documented. So when you imagine the clashing swords of ancient Rome, remember the unseen hands behind the scenes, the scribes, accountants, clerks, and managers who kept the wheels of blood turning. But what did it take to become one of these gladiators? And what happened when they resisted the system? You now know that behind every thrust of a gladius stood reams of bureaucratic structure. But what about the men behind the weapons? What was it like to live every day knowing you were a human commodity rented, trained, and possibly discarded? In this section, we'll peel back the layers further. This isn't about the roar of the crowd. This is about the whispered rumors. At night, the clank of chains during forced marches, and the quiet horror of gladiators who resisted and the paper trail they left behind. Gladiators didn't appear by magic. They were sourced. Rome had multiple gladiator schools spread across the empire, but most of them were located near population centers, Capua, Pompeii, and of course Rome itself. These schools needed a continuous influx of men to replace the dead, the wounded, and the retired. Where did these men come from? War captives. Rome's constant expansion filled its coffers with prisoners, slaves sold at markets strong. Youthful bodies fetched a higher price. Criminals, noxi, condemned to fight as a form of execution. Volunteers, octorati, desperate, free citizens, often debt-ridden. Each gladiator had a dossier on identifying record that included name or assigned alias, origin, status, slave or free, style of combat, number of matches fought, wins, losses, injuries, and notes. From trainers, Gladiators were branded not just literally some bore marks, but administratively. They were counted, sorted, and filed. Even their funerary arrangements were tracked, especially for those who were contract-bound or valuable. Resistance was rare, but when it occurred, it shook the empire. The most infamous case was the rebellion, led by Spartacus in 73 BCE, often romanticized. This revolt began in the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, where around 70 gladiators broke free using kitchen knives and training swords. Their escape wasn't chaotic, it was calculated. They stormed a cart carrying real weapons, and then they fled not into hiding, but into open revolt. By the time the Senate realized the seriousness, Spartacus commanded tens of thousands, including escaped slaves and shepherds. But what about the paperwork? The moment the revolt began, records had to be updated. To the property request for military assistance, local officials filed urgent petitions to Rome. Regional governors drafted reports. And after the rebellion was eventually crushed in 71 BCE by Marcus Licinius Crassus, thousands of gladiators were crucified along the Appian Way, a calculated act of state terror. This was more than punishment, it was recorded precedent. Other ludi reviewed their protocols. Chains were reinforced. Guards were doubled. New bureaucratic rules required daily head counts and random inspections. It was a lesson taught in blood and logged in ink, while the arena was a stage. The ludus was a prison, and one under constant surveillance. Each school had its own hierarchy. Doctors, veteran fighters turned instructors, linista, the overall head of the school. Custodes, enforcers, and guards, medici, doctors responsible for health, but also for keeping fighters fightable. But more sinister were the informants. Gladiators were encouraged to report on each other. Sometimes rewards were given for catching those planning escape or rebellion. This built an atmosphere of paranoia and obedience, where even a whispered complaint could find its way into the daily report. Many of these reports didn't survive, but enough did to reconstruct what a typical disciplinary file looked like. Fabius Murmillo reprimanded for fighting outside assigned hours. Restrict rations for 3 days. No access to practice weapons for 5. And sometimes Cassius Riciarius, caught exchanging notes with slave girl. Request approval for 3 lashes. Or worse, Lucius, suspected of inciting rebellion, moved to isolated cell. Interrogation pending. The daily grind wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare, and the pen was just as sharp as the sword. What was the long-term mental state of a gladiator? Archaeological evidence gives us physical trauma, but Roman literature and graffiti give us glimpses into mental anguish. Graffiti, found in Pompeii, speaks of fear, longing, and loss. Some inscriptions were written by the gladiators themselves. The ever-present threat of death created high levels of stress and psychological collapse. The Roman approach to mental illness was primitive. Many cases were dismissed as cowardice or punished outright. Some gladiators were known to have taken their own lives in creative ways to escape the arena. One particularly famous case involved a fighter who reportedly choked himself to death using a sponge on a sticka. Would mark the man as dishonored. His body might be denied a proper burial. In this world, dying in battle was better than dying by choice. Dead gladiators weren't just discarded, they were processed. The moment a fighter died, the match referee, often dressed as Quran, declared. The official result, a note-taker logged the match details. The corpse was dragged to a prep area. Death was certified often by a blow to the head to ensure it. The body was either sold to the family, if free, buried in a gladiator cemetery, or disposed of in mass pits. But even here, he fought with honor. May the gods feast with him. Funerary clubs existed, groups of gladiators who pooled resources to ensure proper burial. These clubs were legal entities with bylaws and treasuries. Monthly dues were collected and detailed. Rosters kept. Successful ones had fans, lovers, and nicknames. Their faces appeared on oil lamps, vases, and graffiti walls. Some even endorsed products, but with popularity came tracking. Records were kept of wins and losses, style preferences, crowd reactions, betting, odds and payouts. Rome's gambling culture fed off gladiator games. Bookmakers operated in the stands, and results were posted on boards. The administrative apparatus of betting was immense, and gladiator records became commodities used for strategy, speculation, and bribery. Lanistas had to ensure their fighters were not throwing matches. Match fixing existed, and so did punishment for it. One record reads, Harpocrates accused of false surrender, withdraw payment, confiscate winnings. By the late empire, as Rome's economy fractured, the system behind the games began to break down. The paperwork grew more chaotic. In others, they became more desperate, more violent, more exploitative. The end was coming, but not yet. Beneath the sand, behind the swords, lay a world of contracts, surveillance, rebellion, and ritual. A world where freedom could be bartered and death was budgeted. But still, gladiators fought, some for survival, some for glory, and some for one last chance at dignity. But what happened to the ones who survived? What life waited beyond the arena gates for those who were allowed to leave? We've tracked the gladiator from his entry into the arena's machinery through rebellion, suffering, and death. But not all met their end on the sand. A few, very few, survived, and those survivors encountered a new kind of challenge: how to exist in a world that had once consumed them. This section explores the strange, often invisible world of retired gladiators, their struggles, the bureaucracies that followed them, even into freedom, and the quiet, uncertain legacies they left behind. The most coveted object in a gladiator's life wasn't a weapon, it was the rudis, a wooden sword that signified freedom. A gladiator awarded the rudis was officially released from obligation. These men were called rudieri, retired gladiators, often celebrated in the arena one last time before being dismissed. But their transition wasn't simple. To receive a rudis, the following conditions usually had to be met: a pre-agreed number of fights, fulfilled exceptional valor, or popularity in the arena, request approved by the lanista or sponsor, who often needed to be compensated for the loss of their property. The event was often ceremonial. The crowd applauded. The editor would present the rudis in front of thousands. But once the applause died down, the real world began. It wasn't always forgiving. What did Rome do with a retired killer trained in blood sport? Some became trainers, doctors, returning to the ludus to pass on skills. Others opened taverns or bathhouses, cashing in on their fame. A few joined private security forces or even local militias, their combat skills too valuable to ignore. The unlucky or the forgotten slipped into poverty, begging near arenas they once ruled. Rome had no centralized pension system. The best a fighter could hope for was a one-time payment, if contractually arranged a plot of land, granted occasionally as a reward. Burial rites through a funerary club or brotherhood documents show that some gladiators applied for citizenship privileges, while others petitioned for tax exemption, both rarely granted. One record describes a retired fighter who returned to his village after a decade, only to be rejected by his own family, who believed him cursed by death. His appeal to the local magistrate for assistance survives on a clay tablet, but no follow-up exists. Fame was a fleeting reward. A gladiator might be adored during his fighting years, his name etched into walls, his face stamped on souvenirs, but public memory was short. Unless one became a legend, like Spiculus, Flamma, or Carpaphorus, obscurity was inevitable. Flamma, a Syrian-born Resiarius, refused his rudies 4 times. He fought 34 documented matches, winning the crowd's love. He died at age 30 and was buried with honors. His grave marker reads, Flamma, Syriacus, 34 matches, 21 wins, 9 draws, 4 losses, lived 30 years. But most graves did not survive. Most names were lost. In some towns, graffiti reveals once famous Rudieri, now forgotten. Who remembers Magnus, the tiger killer, dead, and no coin for drink? Even in death, gladiators needed administrative sponsorship to be remembered. Gravestones, while rare, provide vital glimpses into the gladiator's afterlife. Common elements on epitaphs include name and origin type of fighter, murmillo, secutor, etc. Fight statistics, wins, losses, draws, age, at death, short verse or message. 1 stone from Capua reads, Here lies Hermes, who fought 16 times. He died not in the arena but in his sleep, a free man. The gods were merciful. Sometimes fellow fighters paid for these memorials, a tradition among funerary brotherhoods. A few even included images, armor carved in relief, or a figure mid-strike. These graves served as warnings and propaganda reminders of Roman power and the price of disobedience. But many who survived long enough to bury others never received a stone of their own. For those who tried to return to civil life, reintegration was difficult. Physical injuries often left fighters unable to work. Social stigma followed them. Romans admired gladiators from afar, but considered them tainted by violence. Mental scars lingered, as we see in records of erratic behavior, bar fights, and even suicides among former fighters. Some former gladiators became civic spectacles, themselves hired for private duels at elite banquets or used as guards at brothels. The Rudiarius was both revered and reviled, too famous to be ignored, too dangerous to be accepted. A common saying in 3rd century Rome, trust not the man who once drew blood for coin. Though not unions in the modern sense, gladiator brotherhoods, collegia, acted as mutual aid societies. These groups maintained registers of doucensured burial rites, negotiated with owners and city officials, provided legal advocates. In some cases, one document from Ostia lists monthly expenses of a gladiator collegium, purchase of incense for funerals, maintenance of shared tombs, food offerings during festivals, wages. During periods of unrest, collegia were banned outright. but criminalized for simply organizing with his fellows as Christianity spread through the empire. Gladiator games fell out of favor. By the 4th century CE, figures like Saint Telemachus, who allegedly died trying to stop a gladiatorial contest, symbolized a moral shift. Eventually, Emperor Honorius banned the games outright in 404 CE, not out of mercy, but under pressure from a changing society. What did this mean for the last generation of gladiators? Many were freed, but without support. Some found refuge in monasteries, turning to faith. A few joined mercenary companies, plying their trade beyond Rome's borders. Their records vanish after this point. All that remains are the broken mosaics, scratched graffiti, and eroded bones, testimony to lives lived between spectacle and silence. The gladiator's afterlife is less about tombstones and more about the institutional forgetting of violence. For centuries, gladiators were registered, taxed, endured, mourned, replaced, and then, when they were no longer needed, they were erased. Their paperwork vanished into fire, flood, and apathy. Their stories, when preserved, were often twisted by myth and morality, but in excavated trash heaps, abandoned graveyards, and scorched papyri, we can still hear their lives whisper, buried beneath sand, oil, and bureaucracy. In the end, the Roman gladiator was not just a fighter, but a living file in the empire's brutal accounting system, born to bleed, trained to obey, and, if lucky, permitted to live long enough to fade. And yet, even in their silence, they changed the world. Their bones tell stories, their contracts reveal systems, their forgotten names still echo beneath the Colosseum's ruins. You've likely heard about Roman aqueducts, those grand arches silhouetted against the Mediterranean sky. But have you ever wondered where all that water went? Or more importantly, where all that waste ended up? Rome may have been the jewel of the ancient world, but beneath its marble grandeur was a world choked by filth, stench, and disease. And at the heart of it all stood one of the greatest, yet least glamorous engineering feats in human history, the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer. This is the story of how the Roman Empire fought an invisible war against its own excrement. How, despite all their brilliance, they may have lost by the 1st century CE. Rome had over 1 million residents, the largest city in the ancient world. With this density came an enormous challenge: sanitation. Over 11 aqueducts supplied nearly 300 million gallons of water per day. Fountains, public baths, latrines, laundries, and private homes all depended on this flow. But the more water Rome received, the more waste it produced. Ancient engineers had to solve a deeply modern problem: how to get rid of it. Built in the 6th century BCE under the Etruscan kings, likely during the reign of Lucius Tarquinius, Prisca Cloaca Maxima began as an open canal. Over centuries, it was roofed over with stone and integrated into the city's expanding layout. But calling it a sewer is misleading. It was massive. Some parts were tall enough for an adult man to walk upright. It drained not just human waste, but rainwater, street runoff, and industrial discharge. It fed into the Tiber River, often untreated. The cloaca wasn't just a marvel, it was a necessity. Without it, Rome would have drowned in its own detritus. But there was a catch. Rome didn't have what we'd call a modern sewage system. Instead, it had a strange hybrid of public drains private cesspits, and flow-based disposal that often led to disaster. Step into a Roman public latrine and you'd see stone benches with cutout holes lined up in rosé channel of running water in front for cleaning sponges. More on that later. Another water channel underneath, leading to the cloaca. There were no partitions, no privacy, just you and a dozen other citizens, talking politics while relieving yourselves. But more interesting was the sponge on a stick, or tersorium. After use, it was rinsed in the front channel and passed on. Yes, communal wiping, and what's worse, that water channel didn't always run clean. If the city's supply faltered if someone upstream used it improperly, the same water meant for cleaning could be contaminated fast. Even elite homes often lacked proper waste removal. Their latrines discharged directly into the street or into shallow drains. Others had cesspits, emptied manually by slaves or by Fallone's laundry workers, who also handled waste for money. In this world, human waste wasn't just refuse it, was a commodity. Rome had a thriving urine economy. Urine contains ammonia, a powerful cleaning agent. Laundry shops collected it in urinals set up in public areas, known as piss pots, phalonicae. People were even paid to donate. It was used for whitening togas, cleaning grease, and stain-standing leather at one point. Emperor Vespasian even taxed urine collection. When criticized, he supposedly held a coin to his nose and said, "Pecunia nan," let money doesn't stink. But as these industries thrived, sanitation worsened. Laundries often dumped their waste urine, dirt, dyes, chemicals back into the streets or drains. You didn't just smell Rome, you waded through it. The Romans understood that filth led to sickness, even if they didn't know about germs. Medical texts mention diseases caused by bad air or unclean vapors. Still, most health efforts were focused on removing waste from public spaces, promoting bathing, not necessarily with soap-burning incense or herbs to purify air, but there were recurring outbreaks, gastrointestinal diseases from dirty water skin, infections from communal baths, rodent infestations from garbage piles, say clogged cloaca, could flood entire neighborhoods with sewage-laced water. Poor maintenance meant backups were frequent, especially during heavy rains. Flooded latrines, sewage-choked alleys, and flies were part of daily life. In a strange irony, Rome's abundance of water made it harder to manage waste. The more the city bathed, drank, and laundered, the more the cloaca had to process. And it was never quite enough. In Rome's sprawling, insulae, multi-story apartment blocks, the lower floors might have basic latrines, but upper floors did not. Residents would use chamber pots, empty them out windows, or simply relieve themselves in stairwells. So imagine walking through a narrow Roman street in summer, dodging human waste, dead animals rotting, vegetables, urine, streams, dust, flight laws forbidding throwing waste from windows. Enforcement was spotty. Complaints piled up in municipal archives. But the city's bureaucracy was overburdened. Occasionally, the emperor would fund public cleanup campaigns, but these were reactive, not systemic. Rome employed public slaves and municipal laborers, known as clocinae, to maintain the system. Their duties: entering clogged tunnels, removing sediment and trash, repairing structural damage, risking gas poisoning, collapse, or disease. These men were often unnamed and unpaid, or compensated through housing and food allowances. Their existence is largely reconstructed through scattered mentions in administrative records. One 2nd century plaque near the Forum Boreum simply reads, "To Marcus, son of Gaius, who kept the cloaca clear during the rains, a faithful servant, a quiet life, a dangerous job, and no glory." Before soap, Romans relied on ash and water to scour surfaces, salt as an abrasive oil to clean skin, scraped off with stridulous perfumes to mask stench-elite homes, might afford fresh lavender, cypress, or cedarwood to scent rooms. Poorer districts burned animal dung or resin to mask odors, but nothing fully eliminated the pervasive smell of Rome. Travelers from distant lands wrote of the city's beauty and its stench. Rome, the eternal city, was a place of paradox, gleaming marble temples beside overflowing gutters, perfumed elites, aqueducts flowing in while waste oozed out. Behind the glory, there was always the cloacand, the people who toiled to keep it from drowning the empire. But what happened when that system failed? What did Rome do in the face of plague, flood, and the collapse of cleanliness? In Section 1, we uncovered the engineering marvel and grotesque realities of Roman sanitation, the cloaca maxima, public latrines, and the invisible laborers who tried to hold back the tide of filth. But systems, no matter how advanced, have limits. What happens when that system breaks? What happens when an empire's waste overwhelms its infrastructure? This section reveals the hidden fragility of Rome's sanitation system, the public health disasters it enabled, and the moments when sewage became an enemy of the state. Rome's ancient enemy wasn't always barbarian invaders, it was the Tiber River. While the Cloaca Maxima was built to drain waste into the river, it had a design flaw: no fail-safes for battle. In times of heavy rain, the Tiber would flood, causing water to surge backward into the city's drainage network. The result? Latrines reversed, spewing waste into streets and homes. Public baths closed, their water mixed with sewage. Markets flooded, spoiling grain and meat supplies. The historian Dio Cassius recorded several floods during the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, each followed by outbreaks of illness and mass panic. The stench alone was noted as a cause for exodus from certain neighborhoods. In 165 CE, the Antonine Plague swept through the empire, killing an estimated 5 million people, likely a form of smallpox or measles. It spread along military roads and trade routes, but Rome's overcrowded, unsanitary conditions turned it into a nightmare. Symptoms included fever, diarrhea, sores, and pustules. Internal bleeding. People avoided public latrines, fearful of contaminated surfaces. Corpses piled in homes. Burial pits overflowed, and the cloaca itself carried runoff from cremation, fires, and decay. The city's elite fled to country villas. The poor had no such luxury, with sewer workers either sick, dead, or unwilling to enter the cloaca. The entire system slowed to a crawl. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, Stoic philosopher, continued his duties amid the smell of burning flesh and human waste. By the 3rd century, Rome's infrastructure was showing its age. Aqueducts cracked, latrines crumbled. The cloaca was clogged with debris, silt, and corpses dumped in secret. The government responded with edicts ordering neighborhood leaders to organize cleaning crews, increased punishment for illegal dumping, temporary sewer tolls to fund maintenance, But it wasn't enough. Records show a surge in urban complaints, especially from lower-income districts. One surviving document addressed to a city edile reads, "We have no clear water. The fountain is dry. The air is foul. The children cough and die." The collapse of sanitation became symbolic of the empire's deeper rot. When emperors walked in triumph, some citizens held their noses. With no consistent garbage removal, Romans turned to fire. Neighborhoods organized burn nights, informal events, where rubbish was gathered and incinerated in open pits. These fires released toxic fumes from leather, dung, and hair soot, which darkened buildings and irritated lungs. Ash clouds carried by wind into homes and temples. In some years, the air over Rome was described as a black fog of filth. Priests interpreted it as a sign of divine anger. Animals fled urban centers. Visitors from distant provinces returned home with tales of a city crumbling under its own refuse. By the time of Emperor Aurelian II, 72 to 75 CE, public services were collapsing. Bathhouses closed, latrines decayed, even aqueducts were sabotaged. During civil wars, water rationing began, first informally, then by decree. The poor lined up at dry fountains, carrying amphorae. The rich hoarded water in cisterns. Black market water sellers emerged, carting barrels down narrow alleys and selling by the cup. Roman hygiene practices changed. Bathing frequency declined. Hair and beards grew long. Perfumes replaced washing. Oils became expensive and rare. An entire hygienic culture unraveled, and with it, Rome's self-image. Rome was no longer the marble city of Augustus. It was a stench-soaked labyrinth, dimly lit and increasingly lawless. With decaying infrastructure came rats, mice, and stray dogs, some feral, some once domesticated. Diseases now spread not just through water and air, but on fleas, fur, and filth. The 3rd and 4th centuries saw a rise in bubonic-like symptoms, though plague wouldn't explode until the 6th century. Increase in rat-borne infections, like leptospiroscan conditions, from bites and contact with excrement. Apartment blocks became vertical slums. The top floors housed the poorest. No water, no latrines, no light. Rats nested in crumbling ceilings. At night, people slept with knives beside them, not just for thieves, but for creatures in the dark. Still, the Roman state tried to preserve order. Even amid chaos, there were official street sweepers, though rarely paid. Public announcements posted on walls warning against open defecation. Sewer access permits granted to the wealthy. Ration cards issued for water. The irony. The empire that had once built the cloaca maxima was now scheduling time slots for basic sanitation. One 4th century document reads, "Let it be known that citizens of the Vicus Scoris may draw water at the 3rd hour. All others must wait." People obeyed till they did. Riots broke out over water disputes, latrine access, and even bathhouse reopening rumors. Sanitation had become a political weapon, a tool of suppression and unrest. As Rome's secular systems collapsed, Christianity began to rise, and with it, new ideas about cleanliness. Early Christians emphasized spiritual purity over bodily purity, charity over civic maintenance, ritual washing rather than public bathing. This shift, while helpful in some ways, also undermined Roman public hygiene norms. The great bathhouses were abandoned. Public works funding was redirected to churches. Pagan engineers, once employed by the state, found themselves irrelevant or persecuted. Cleanliness moved from the public sphere to the private soul. Rome's sanitation crisis wasn't a single disaster, it was a slow decay, a rot beneath the stones, hidden by incense and fading frescoes. The Cloaca Maxima still flowed, but its builders were long gone. Its caretakers were sick or afraid, and the city it had once purified now choked on its own ambition. What, then, remains of this mighty sewer? And how did its story end as legend, ruin, or foundation for what came after? By now, you've walked the reeking streets of ancient Rome, followed the failures of its sanitation system, and seen how flood, plague, and politics turned one of the greatest urban triumphs into a quiet catastrophe. But the story doesn't end there. Rome's sewers, especially the Cloaca Maxima, didn't vanish with the fall of the empire. Like so many Roman ideas, they outlasted their creators, becoming part of a deeper legacy that still shapes the modern world. This final section explores what happened after the toilets overflowed, after the aqueducts dried up, after the empire cracked and faded into history. Unlike nearly every other part of Roman infrastructure, colosseums, baths, temples, the Cloaca Maxima never stopped working. It continued draining the Roman Bade Forum into the Tiber long after the Senate fell silent. During the Middle Ages, it was rediscovered and repaired by new rulers of the city. Even today, parts of the cloaca still flow, hidden beneath the traffic-logged streets of modern Rome. Historians have described it as the oldest, continually operating public works system in the world. Ancient engineers may not have known the word sustainability, but their work embodied it. How? The cloaca was built with over-engineering layers of volcanic stone, waterproof concrete, and architectural foresight. It relied on gravity, not pumps, making it energy-free. It had modular expansion points, allowing later regimes to plug in or divert flow. In an empire obsessed with conquest and glory, the greatest triumph may have been a sewer that refused to die. When Rome fell to Germanic tribes in 476 CE, its population plummeted from over 1 million to fewer than 50,000 within a century. The Forum became a pasture. Aqueducts fell into disrepair, but the Cloaca Maxima, it remained in the medieval period. The sewers took on a new mythology. People believed evil spirits lived in the tunnels. The church warned against demonic smells rising from the drains. Pilgrims and monks told stories of saints who walked the cloaca as penance. Sewer entrances were sealed, not for engineering, but to trap hellish forces. And yet, maintenance crews still existed, now called tombkeepers or dungeon sweepers. They weren't public servants. They were outcasts, some criminal, some leprous, performing a duty few dared to watch. As medieval Rome slowly revived thanks to the papacy and trade, the question of sanitation returned. Water once again flowed through rudimentary channels, sometimes using remains of Roman systems. Latrines returned, though they were privately managed, but with no empire to regulate them. Sanitation became a neighborhood problem, not a civic duty. In the Renaissance, Roman ruins were studied anew. Engineers began mapping ancient sewer lines, marveling at their longevity. By the 16th century, Michelangelo sketched sewer paths under St. Peter's Basilica. Papal engineers commissioned restoration of sections of the cloaca. The Vatican, even, declared the system a protected heritage structure. Rome's sewers, once feared, became points of pride. The ideas behind the Cloaca Maxima eventually rippled outward. 1. Urban planning. Cities across Europe began considering centralized waste systems. Inspired by Rome, Paris, London, Constantinople each flirted with sewer design. Few succeeded until the 19th century. But the Roman blueprint remained a reference point to concrete science. Roman pozzolanic concrete, used in sewer linings, fascinated modern engineers. It was resilient underwater. Long before Portland cement existed, studies as late as the 21st century confirmed that Roman concrete actually gets stronger over time due to rare volcanic ash chemistry. 3. Water ethics. Roman sanitation left a strange legacy in law. Ideas like public access to water, liability for waste disposal, government duty to maintain cleanliness, found their way into early European municipal codes. Modern archaeology has turned the study of sanitation into a thriving discipline by excavating latrines, cesspits, and clogged sewer lines. Researchers have learned more about daily life than from palaces and tombs. Findings include parasite eggs, whipworm, roundworm, confirming disease rates, seeds, bones, and shells, showing Roman diets and trade, roots, lost, jewelry, coins, and tools, likely dropped in latrines, graffiti inside sewer tunnels, scrawled by maintenance workers. One famous inscription reads, "I, Sextus, cleaned this filth so Rome could breathe," a humble boast, and perhaps the most honest monument in the city. Rome's sanitation system ultimately failed, not because of bad design, but because of overuse, underfunding, and political neglect, an eerily modern set of problems. Today's global sanitation crises echo ancient Rome. Overcrowded megacities with failing sewage, informal waste workers risking disease, infrastructure ignored until collapse. UN reports cite over 2 billion people lacking proper sanitation, despite millennia of precedent. In that sense, the Cloaca Maxima is more than a sewer, it's a warning. Civilizations rise on clean water and fall in dirty streets. The ancient Romans saw sanitation as a form of civic virtue. To build a sewer was not just an act of engineering, it was an expression of order. They didn't always succeed, but they tried, and in the end, that the commitment to cleanliness amid chaos became their truest legacy. So the next time you flush a toilet, walk dry pavement during a storm, or drink a clean glass of water from the tap, remember this. Long before Rome rose, before Greece pondered philosophy, before Egypt built its pyramids, there were the mud brick cities of Mesopotamia. This was the cradle of civilization, a land where rivers met, where empires were born, not in stone, but in sun-dried clay. It's where writing, the wheel, bureaucracy, and urban life emerged not as grand spectacles, but as slow, grinding necessities of survival in a harsh world. And yet, the people of ancient Mesopotamia lived lives not so unlike ours. They paid taxes, gossiped about their neighbors, swept courtyards, and feared flooding. This is their story, not of kings and conquest, but of bricks, bread, and boring but beautiful history. Mesopotamia means land between rivers, referring to the Tigris and Euphrates. Today, that region spans modern Iraq, parts of Syria, and Kuwait. It's flat, dry, and prone to sudden flooding. Rainfall was rare. Agriculture depended entirely on irrigation, a massive network of canals and ditches dug and maintained by hand. So, from its beginning, Mesopotamian life was dominated not by priests or warriors, but by farmers, water managers, and administrators. Canals required daily maintenance, silt needed constant clearing, floodgates were regulated by local overseers. NTR villages could vanish in a bad season. This forced early cities to invent one of humanity's greatest curses, or gifts. Bureaucracy. Stone was rare, wood scarce, so homes, whether palaces or peasant huts, were made of mud brick, shaped by hand and baked in the sun. These bricks were cheap and abundant, easy to mold, insulating against desert heat, but they were also fragile. Walls eroded with rain, melted in floods, and crumbled without maintenance. This meant most buildings were constantly rebuilt. A house lasted a few decades, a temple maybe a century. Urban streets were filled with mud brick rubble, and many layers of Mesopotamian cities were built atop older, disintegrated ones. Archaeologists call this tell stratigraphy, each layer representing generations of rebuilding, sweeping, and starting again. Inside the home, floors were made of packed clay, roofs were flat, used for drying grain or sleeping. Furniture was minimal. Low tables, reed mats, clay ovens. Cleanliness mattered. Many homes had drainage holes, brooms, and pots for wastewater. Imagine living in a house that literally melts during a rainy month, and you'll understand Mesopotamian domestic anxiety. Mesopotamians lived off barley, not wheat. It was hearty and flood tolerant, but bitter and coarse. Bread was the staple, and so was beer, brewed from fermented barley loaves. A typical meal for a commoner might include flatbread or barley, porridge, dried dates, or onions, occasionally goat milk or cheesy thin barley. Beer with floating sediment meat was a luxury. Most animals, goats, sheep, cattle, were too valuable alive. Fish were common near rivers, but often dried and salted. Cooking was done on clay hearths with wood or dried animal dung. Kitchen smoke drifted through holes in the roof or not at all. Yet, despite these limits, Mesopotamian cuisine had sophistication. Clay tablets record recipes for stews, and roast scribes noted proper spice combinations, often including garlic, cumin, and coriander. Priests kept detailed records of temple feasts, where hundreds were fed. Food wasn't just survival, it was a ritual, an offering, and a marker of class. Mesopotamia didn't invent language, but it did invent writing. Around 3200 BCE, temple administrators began scratching marks into wet clay using a reed stylus. This early system cuneiform recorded grain rations, tax payments, livestock counts, trade receipts. The first written sentence in history is stunningly boring. 29086. Measures of barley received over 37 months. Signed, Kushim. And yet, that's the point. Writing was invented to manage surplus, not to tell stories. It was the product of anxiety about fairness, memory, accountability. Scribes were trained for years, mastering hundreds of wedge-shaped signs. Schools were strict. Mistakes were punished with beatings or extended practice. And most scribes were men, though some evidence suggests elite women were trained, especially in temple contexts. Their job wasn't glamorous. They copied the same contracts, the same tax codes, the same complaints over and over, but they made civilization possible. With surplus came inequality, and with inequality came debt. Mesopotamian society had rigid classes: Awailu, free landowning; Elite Mushkanu, free but lower status; workers Hordu, slaves. Often captives or debtors' laws dictated how much barley each class owed in tax, what crimes were punishable by death, and how to resolve land disputes. You could sell your land, lease your donkey, pawn your child to pay a debt. Yes, parents sometimes handed over children as debt laborers, recorded in clay contracts. Even temples, which were tax-exempt, engaged in leasing fields, hiring labor, and charging interest. Some temples acted like banks, demanding grain repayment at 33% interest compounded annually. This system bred resentment periodically. Kings like Hammurabi or Urukagina would proclaim debt forgiveness, canceling loans and freeing debt slaves. These decrees were both practical and political, preventing rebellion and asserting divine justice. Yet, despite reforms, most commoners lived on the edge. One bad flood, one dead ox, one poor harvest, and they were destitute. Mesopotamian cities were dense, hot, and dusty. But they weren't clueless about sanitation. Many homes had drains to channel water. Out courtyards included waste pits, and clay urinals. Public streets were swept by laborers or slaves. Larger cities, like Ur and Nippur, even had early sewer channels, Brooklyn, tunnels carrying runoff to canals. But there was no unified plumbing. Waste still ended up in canals used for irrigation. Streets during floods, courtyard corners. If no one was looking, diseases like dysentery, parasites, and skin infections were common. Priests offered ritual purification, and doctors prescribed remedies, some effective, others magical. A common practice was to wear amulets or sleep with sacred texts under your pillow to ward off illness in this world. Cleanliness was spiritual, physical, and social all at once. Despite the heat, the debt, the collapsing mud briquette was life, and it was lived richly. Families gathered in courtyards. Children chased goats and practiced cuneiform on soft clay. Neighbors gossiped over low walls. Letters on clay show wives scolding absent husbands, sisters arranging weddings, parents complaining about lazy sons, tenants arguing about rent. In one tablet, a woman writes, "Send more beer. Your last batch was weak. I will not serve it at the festival." Another reads, "Your donkey ate my onions. You owe me 1 shekel. It's all so ordinary, and that's what makes it beautiful. You may never have heard of Kushum Sholgi or Lugalbanda. You may never visit a museum to marvel at a mud brick, but their world of balancing ledgers, baking bread, and patching up crumbling walls was the foundation of yours. They weren't gods or heroes. They were administrators, builders, parents, and scribes, the architects of normality. But how did these fragile cities survive for centuries? And what happened when droughts, war, or floods pushed them too far? In Section 1, we explored the humble rhythms of life in ancient Mesopotamia, built on mud brick, barley, scribes, and the rituals of survival. But no civilization exists in stasis. Mesopotamia was not immune to crisis. Its cities, so carefully carved out of clay and irrigation, were perpetually vulnerable to natural disaster, economic turmoil, and most of all, human ambition. This section reveals what happened when the balance of daily life then suddenly end, how ancient bureaucracies faced the terrifying realization that no amount of paperwork can stop a drought. Mesopotamian agriculture depended on precise irrigation, timed with seasonal floods. But beginning around 2200 BCE, the climate began to shift. The Akkadian Empire, at its height under Sargon and Naram-Sin, faced a disaster that even their conquests couldn't conquer. A century-long drought, the 4.2 kiloyear event. Evidence from sediment cores and pollen samples shows a sharp drop in rainfall dust storms that blanketed cities, a collapse of cereal grain pollen, indicating crop failure. Irrigation canals dried up. Villages were abandoned. The great cities of the North Akadmari, Tel Leland shrunk or vanished. Clay tablets tell of famine grain prices multiplying tenfold, temple storage pits, empty peasants migrating south, overwhelming other cities. The administrators responded the only way they knew how. They wrote more. They recounted lost harvests, cataloged refugee movements, sized new labor quotas, but bureaucracy cannot irrigate empty canals without regular maintenance. Mud brick buildings decay rapidly as labor was diverted to survival. Even temples and palaces fell into neglect. Walls slumped, roofs sagged, streets flooded from blocked drains. Pestilence followed. In one tablet from the city of Lagash, a scribe writes, "The roof has fallen again. We patch it, but it sinks. There is no more bitumen. The rains come too late." Mud brick, so easy to build, was just as easy to lose. Cities that had stood for centuries withered in the sun, swallowed by wind and time, as central governments weakened under the weight of environmental collapse. Foreign raiders appeared. In the north, the most feared were the Gutians, mountain tribes from the Zagros range. Akkadian texts portray them as savage, dirty, illiterate, uncontrollable. This was racism, fear, or both. We know that Gushan incursions disrupted trade routes, raided farmland, overran, weakened cities for decades. Mesopotamia descended into what later texts called the Dark Time, a period with fewer records, fewer kings, and no empire. A lament from a Sumerian tablet mourns, "No one treads the road. The fields are silent. The oxen cry out, but no plow follows." It wasn't an apocalypse, it was a slow deurbanization. People abandoned cities, returning to villages or nomadic herding. The clay tablets stopped coming, and silence grew. Even as cities collapsed, scribes kept writing. Some of the last documents from Yor and Lagash are remarkable for their quiet despair. One tax list includes farmers who no longer lived, fields overtaken by dustwater quotas, left unfulfilled, notes like missing with the Guthians or fled south. Another document is a ration list for temple workers, half the amount from just a decade earlier, but nowhere do we see official acknowledgement of collapse. No king proclaims failure. No priest admits the gods have turned away. Instead, we see denial by documentationists. If keeping the ink flowing could stop the walls from crumbling. Around 2100 BCE, a powerful figure rose in the southern city of Uranamu. He launched the Yor III dynasty, one of the most detailed bureaucracies in ancient history. Uranamu's response to crisis was order. Order and more order. He and his son Shalgi standardized measurements of grain, silver, and land, enforced labor. Conscription to rebuild canals compiled law codes, including penalties for overcharging or tax evasion, built massive ziggurats. Signaling divine restoration, the Yor III period saw population regrowth, resettlement of villages, renewed temple activity, rebuilding of scribal schools, but it came at a cost. Yor III was hyper-administrative. Some towns recorded daily grain rations for every worker, tracked by name. Failure to meet quotas led to punishment. The state grew invasive, controlling movement, marriage, and labor. One surviving text lists 3,400 workers assigned to a canal project, each name, each day worked, each payment in barley. It was control as salvation, a massive, coordinated effort to hold civilization together with styluses and clay. In Yor III, bureaucracy became a tool of both resilience and repression. Temples didn't just worship, they governed. Priests collected taxes, distributed food, and administered justice. Scribes were now powerful intermediaries, able to rewrite land claims, interpret labor contracts, confirm or deny inheritances. One scandalous case shows a scribe altering the clay tablet of a dying landowner, erasing the daughter's name in favor of a cousin. The courts reversed it, but not before violence broke out. Writing wasn't just administrative, it was political. Yor III didn't last. By 2004 BCE, the city of Yor was sacked by the Elamites, eastern rivals who tore through the weakened state. Temples were looted, archives burned, ziggurats defaced. A lament from the time reads, "The walls fall, the scribes weep, the goddess Inanna turns her face." But even here we find resilience. The people didn't vanish, they rebuilt again. Cities like Babylon rose, new kings, new gods, but the same bricks, the same reeds, the same barley fields. Mesopotamia wasn't a single empire, it was a cycle of cities. Civilization isn't a miracle. It's not a golden age frozen in marble. It's daily maintenance, held together by mud, math, and memory. When Mesopotamia collapsed, it did so slowly through failing canals, forgotten rations, and drying fields. But every time it fell, it also rose again, not with trumpets, but with clay tablets. But who were the people left to pick up the pieces? And how did the everyday scribes, merchants, and farmers shape the legacy that followed? Civilizations are rarely defined by their rulers. The great kings of Mesopotamia, Sargon, Hammurabi, Shulgime, have ruled by divine favor, but their empires were built and rebuilt by anonymous hands. This final section tells the story of those hands, the scribes, laborers, traders, and children who carried the mud-brick cities on their backs. It also explores what was left behind, not in golden tombs or royal decrees, but in the quiet records of ordinary life. When the walls fell, these were the people who remained. If we know anything about Mesopotamia, it is because of scribes, the bureaucrats, clerks, and accountants who pressed history into clay with nothing but a stylus to become a scribe. A boy, almost always male, began training at age 5 or 6. He spent years copying word lists, math problems, and proverbs. He memorized over 600 cuneiform signs. He practiced until his tablets were neat enough to be stored. Schools were called Edaba, the house of tablets. They were not pleasant places. Tablets from pupils survive with scratched lines, like, "I did not copy my tablet, I was beaten. The teacher is angry. I forgot the measurement signs again." But once trained, scribes were indispensable. They kept temple accounts, oversaw construction projects, scored marriages, deaths, debts, and lawsuits, wrote letters across kingdoms. Often informal Akkadian scribes were the internet of their time, but slower, dustier, and more durable. They preserved not just king's boasts, but shopping lists, gossip, insults, and poetry. It's easy to think of ancient people as silent, but Mesopotamian tablets prove otherwise. Thousands of letters survive from non-royal individuals. A few examples. A woman named Taram Sagila writes to a relative complaining about a wool delivery. A man named Il-Shubani accuses his neighbor of stealing a donkey. A schoolboy scrawls a note, "Tell my father to send more fish and beer." Even servants and slaves left their mark. "To my master, do not be angry. The barley spoiled in the sun. I feared to tell you." These voices remind us that beneath the towering ziggurats and royal epics were people trying to survive, make a living, and write home. Mesopotamia was deeply urban, but also connected. Trade was essential. From as early as 3000 BC, cities like your Uruk and Nippur imported cedar wood from Lebanon, tin and copper from Anatolia, and Iran, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold and spices from the Indus. Valley merchants left records on small clay tokens sealed in envelopes. Yes, Mesopotamians used clay envelopes, which had to be broken to read the tablet inside in city markets. People bartered. Grain pottery, tools, cloth, beads, and cent standard prices were recorded in law codes, but haggling was common. One letter complains, "Your last shipment was short. You said 12 minas, but gave 9. I counted it myself." Merchants were also risk-takers. A trade journey to Dilmun, modern Bahrain, could take months by boat, and risks included piracy, storms, disease, famine. At Portsmouth, trade kept the cities alive, linking even isolated villages to the flow of goods, ideas, and gossip. Religion was not a matter of belief, it was a function of order. Each city had a patron god: Enlil for Nipperinana, for Uruk Nana, for your temples were economic centers, not just shrines. They owned land, employed thousands, collected taxes in grain and labor district. Food during famine, priests consulted omens to predict floods, plagues, or royal success. They read liver spots on sacrificed animals, cracks in burnt bone, star patterns, and eclipses in usual births, and animal behavior. Asic ox could lead to policy changes. People made oaths at temples, settled contracts before idols, and offered bread and beer to gods for favor. But religion wasn't always comforting. The gods were unpredictable, and misfortune was often blamed on divine wrath. A common prayer from a clay tablet reads, "The sin I committed, I do not know. The God I angered, I cannot name. May he forgive me." It is strikingly human. As centuries passed, cities rose and fell, but their bones remained. Ruins were scavenged for bricks. Abandoned canals were repurposed. Even burials were layered into rebuilt homes, making each house a museum of its own ancestry. Children played on rooftops above forgotten kings. Traders sold barley in streets layered with centuries of dust. Scribes copied contracts using tablets dug from older archives. Time was not linear, it was stacked, like the bricks they built with. Even today, Mesopotamian tells are layers of daily life, compressed into hills. A dig might uncover a temple flore, marketplace, kitchen hearth, child's toya. Love letter all from different centuries, but the same place. Mesopotamia faded, not with a bang, but with assimilation. The Babylonians inherited its cities. The Assyrians expanded them into military centers. The Persians absorbed its gods and writing. The Greeks romanticized it. The Romans ignored it. The desert buried it. And yet, in the 19th century, European archaeologists began to unearth strange bricks marked with wedge-shaped signs. They didn't know the language. They didn't know the people, but they found libraries, entire rooms of baked clay tablets, still legible after 3,000 years. Among them, lists of kings, inventories of sheep, wedding contracts, curse tablets, and a world's first known story, the Epic of Gilgamesha, tale of friendship, grief, and mortality. A king who searches for meaning and fails, just like us. Mesopotamia reminds us that civilization isn't built on glory, it's built on mud, math, and the mundane. Its people didn't leave us pyramids or marble. They left records on taxes, tools, gossip, and grief. They didn't try to be remembered. They just tried to manage life, one grain of barley, one broken brick, one scribbled tablet at a time. And because of that, they became immortal. They built roads across continents, fought wars for emperors, and defended the edges of the known world. But before the gladius, before the shield, before the famous formations, the Roman soldier marched on his stomach, and that stomach, more often than not, was filled with dull, repetitive, nutritionally calibrated food, stored and rationed with the precision of a modern supply chain. In the great machine of the Roman Empire, feeding the legion was as important as arming it, perhaps more so. This is not a tale of battlefield valor. This is a story of dried pulses, brined meat, hard biscuits, and how an empire's strength rested on the predictable misery of its soldiers. Meals, at the core of every Roman soldier's diet, was grain, primarily wheat or barley for the less fortunate. The average legionary was issued enough grain to bake their own bread every day. But this wasn't fluffy focaccia, it was coursed, almost rock hard after baking this. Bread was often referred to as buchelatum, the original hardtack. It was baked twice to remove moisture, carried in satchels for weeks eaten dry or soaked in water. Vinegar or wine to soften eat it required strong teeth or a small hammer. And yet, Roman soldiers did eat it day after day because it was durable, cheap, and portable. Salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was a strategic resource. Soldiers received salt allowances. They used it to preserve meat, flavor, gruel, clean wounds, and even trade locally. The word salary, from Latin salarium, originally referred to salt money, an allowance paid to Roman soldiers in Roman camps. Salt served as a preservative for meat and fish, a medicinal agent for skin and stomach ailments, a tool of discipline. Denying salt was a form of punishment too. Could march a Roman army across a continent with enough salt, barley, and vinegar, and they did. Fresh meat was a luxury in the Roman army. Most soldiers subsisted on salted pork or bacon-dried sausages, lucanicae, occasionally goat, mutton, or beef. Jerky meat was issued less frequently than grain, and much of it came in brine-filled barrels, shipped from large supply centers. Spoilage was common, and cases of food poisoning appear in medical texts from the era. Some garrisons, especially on the frontier, raised their own pigs or hunted locally. Others received fish sauce garum as a protein source. Garum was made from fermented fish innards stored in ceramic jugs, so foul-smelling that it was banned indoors yet. It was beloved perhaps because anything was better than buccelatum. In addition, 2-grain soldiers received lentils, chickpeas, broad beans. These were boiled into gruels or stews, often flavored with vinegar or garlic. The standard dish was polza, simple, porridge-like mix that served as breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on availability. Flavorings included onion, leek cabbage, herbs. When possible, fiber was not in short supply. Roman soldiers consumed a lot of roughage, leading to frequent bowel movements. Latrine hygiene was part of the camp's daily routine. The sponges on sticks seen earlier in gladiator settings were also used here. Military camps had latrine trenches cleaned by designated latrine guards, an inglorious but necessary post. Roman soldiers drank posca, a mixture of water and vinegar. Why? It purified water to some degree. It prevented stomach infections. It added taste to otherwise bland food. It was cheap and portable. Legionaries often mixed posca with herbs, honey, or leftover bread for added nutrition. Wine was reserved for officers or special occasions. Ordinary soldiers rarely had access to clean water. Posca was the safest bet. And yes, posca had alcohol content very low, but just enough to numb discomfort after a 20-mile march in iron armor. Each Roman century, about 80 men, was divided into contubinier, units of 8 men who shared a tent and a cook fire. Cooking duties rotated among them. Equipment included portable iron grills, clay or bronze pots, wooden spoons, and ladle skin flasks for water and vinegar. Camp kitchens were standardized. Every marching camp had designated cooking zones, away from tents to reduce fire risk. Ash pits and grease disposal zones were marked and cleaned regularly. Cleanliness wasn't a matter of comfort, it was survival. A contaminated stew could sicken half a century in a day. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a disciplinary tool. Centurions could reduce rations for disobedience, withhold meat, or salt, force extra chores in the kitchen. A soldier who misbehaved might be reassigned to latrine detail, fed only bread and water, denied wine for weeks. On the other hand, exceptional service could mean extra meat, dried fruit, or cheese. Local delicacies after a campaign food was part of the military reward system, every bit as important as medals or public praise. Roman legions stretched from Britain to Syria. At the fringes of empire, supply lines failed, especially in winter or during revolt. When this happened, soldiers relied on foraging berries, roots, small animals, hunting boar, deer, or local game, trading with locals if relations were peaceful, eating pack animals in emergencies. Archaeological digs at Roman forts in Germany and Britain show animal bones, charred bread, remnants, burned barley, and millet, imported spices, and Mediterranean amphor. Even on the edge of nowhere, Roman camps kept the illusion of Roman order, right down to olive oil shipped 2,000 miles to flavor bland porridge. The Roman soldier conquered the world, not with grand speeches or elite cuisine, but with vinegar, barley, and boiled lentils. His world was measured in calories, rations, and the reliability of a campfire stew. And yet, these humble meals powered the most formidable military force of the ancient world. But what happened when the rations failed? What did hunger look like inside a Roman fort, under siege or in mutiny? You now know what fed the Roman soldier. In times of peace and stability, bread, salt, pasta, and pulses, carefully rationed and standardized. But Rome's legions didn't always operate within the neat confines of a fortified camp. Sometimes the food ran out. When it did, meals turned into memories. Hunger became the marching companion, and the act of eating or not became a test of survival, loyalty, and even morality. In this section, we explore the darker underside of the Roman ration system. What happened when supplies failed, when sieges stretched for months, and when food became a weapon both of the state and against it. Siege warfare in the Roman world was common and brutal. Cities like Carthage, Masada, and Jerusalem endured months or years of starvation before falling. But the besiegers suffered too, while civilians starved behind walls. Roman legions, camping outside, had to guard supply lines for months' forage in hostile territory. Dig siege works while under fire render hunger, disease, and exhaustion. In the Siege of Numantia, Spain, 133 BCE, Roman supplies grew so thin that rations were halved. Soldiers ground acorns into paste and roasted animal hides for protein. Wine was diluted until it was vinegar in name only. Officers recorded weight loss, weakness, and mutiny threats. Starving soldiers did not stay disciplined for long. Rome knew the power of food, and so did its soldiers. Throughout its history, the legions occasionally mutinied over late, pace-spoiled, or missing rations, inedible supplies, and fair food distribution between ranks. One of the most famous incidents occurred after the death of Augustus in 14 CE at the Rhine frontier. Soldiers demanded better rations, shorter service terms, full pensions paid in grain and land. When these demands were ignored, they refused to march. Threatened, their commanders offered the imperial throne to a popular general. Tacitus records that spoiled meat and weevil-ridden grain sparked outrage. The bread was moldy, the wine like gall. They said the beasts were better fed. The mutiny only ended when Germanicus, a charismatic commander, gave his own money, executed ringleaders, and promised better supplies. But the message was clear: feed the army or lose it. In hostile regions like Dacia, Parthia, or the forests of Germania, Roman armies learned a hard truth. Armies don't starve from battle. They starve from broken logistics. Opposing forces would burn crops ahead of Roman advance, poison wells, ambush baggage, trains, steel, mules, and wagons at night. In response, Roman generals developed mobile field bakeries, pack mule rotations, supply forts spaced along roads, winter grain caches hidden along campaign routes. But no plan was perfect. In Crassus' Parthian campaign, 53 BCE, Roman forces advanced too far, too fast. Their baggage was delayed, and they began rationing before the first major battle. Soldiers boiled grass, reeds, and leather sandals. The army collapsed, not just from Parthian arrows, but from emptied stomachs. When food ran low, the order came down: procure locally. Roman foraging, called predo, was a semi-organized system where soldiers entered villages, seized food and livestock, recorded items taken in theory, paid later sometimes. But it was messy. Often, foraging blurred into plunder. Soldiers robbed civilians, destroyed local fields, created long-term resentment to prevent abuses. Commanders issued strict rules. Officers had to oversee foraging teams. Inventories were written on tablets. Theft from fellow soldiers meant flogging, or worse still. In practice, foraging was chaotic, especially in enemy territory. In Britannia, legionaries foraged for berries, wild garlic, game animals, freshwater fish. Some soldiers were assigned to temporary farms behind the front lines. These military farmers planted barley and legumes, creating self-sustaining food plots that reduced dependence on distant supply trains. When real food disappeared, Roman soldiers turned to substitutes: millet gruel instead of wheat acorn, cakes in place of bread, charred bones ground into broth, chewed leather, or bark in extreme cases during long winter sieges. Some units relied on crushed, dried, piece-fermented grain paste, like early polenta, dried nettles, and boiled herbs. One Roman medical text suggests a tonic for hunger pangs. Boil vinegar with water and honey. Sip between mouthfuls of air. It was not nutritious, but it dulled the stomach for a time. In stationary forts like Vindolanda, Britain, or Carnuntum, Austria, soldiers ate more regularly, but not always better. Excavated latrines reveal intestinal parasite, signs of chronic diarrhea, spoiled grains, and mold. Rodent remains in storage. Pits. Malnutrition was common during winter, with vitamin deficiencies leading to scurvy, tooth loss, weakened immunity. Officers had better fare. Imported wine, dried fruit, salted olives, but ordinary soldiers ate dried peas, rancid oil, reused fat, whatever they could trade with locals. Letters from Vindolanda show soldiers begging families to send olive oil, socks, cheese, honey cakes. Juani. Note reads simply, "Send more garlic. The stew is dead without it." Roman commanders understood that meals were morale. They used food to punish deserters with half rations. Freyward. Valor with extra wine or cheese build loyalty through shared banquets. Victory parades ended in public feasts, and holidays like Saturnalia meant roasted meats, sweet pastries, and wine. Even for common soldiers. But the reverse was also true. In times of crisis, Rome deployed food denial. Rebels were starved, forts were rations, pavilions were requisitioned. Into famine, food became a language of command, class, and control. In peace, food was fuel. In war, it was a weapon. And in siege, it was the difference between order and collapse. The Roman soldier's life was measured in rations, grain, sacks, and barrels of vinegar. He was as much a logistical unit as a man with a sword. But what happened when the campaign ended? What did Roman soldiers eat in retirement or in the provinces where they stayed forever? We've followed the Roman soldier through his rations, his hunger, and the quiet wars fought over supply. But no campaign lasts forever. Eventually, the roads end, the swords dull, and the once disciplined legionary becomes something else entirely, a veteran. And that veteran, more often than not, remains in the provinces where he served, married to a local, farming strange soil, and cooking what he can afford. This final section examines the often forgotten final chapter of a Roman soldier's life: how he ate, lived, and survived after the war drums stopped and pensioned in outposts, with the taste of vinegar and barley still in his mouth upon retirement, usually after 25 years of service. Roman legionary received a lump sum of money, premia or a land grant in a province, sometimes both. Depending on rank and loyalty, many veterans settled in Goliberian, North Africa Dacian, especially Britannudes, were the borderlands often, where the soldier had spent his service. Rome preferred to plant veterans as colonists to Romanize the region and stabilize the frontier. But the land wasn't always ideal. Often it had poor soil, locals were hostile or resentful, the veteran lacked farming experience. So what did he do? He learned to cook again. This time, not as a soldier, but as a settler, hybrid Roman barbarian with a family and a field to manage. Retired soldiers often adapted Roman recipes to local ingredients. Their diets became hybrids. In Britannia, for example, wheat was often replaced with rye, or oats. Olive oil was rare. Animal fat was used instead. Local herbs like sorrel, mint, and wild garlic-flavored dishes. Beer, not pasca, became the common drink a retired centurion might eat. Oat porridge with cheese, roasted pork with mustard seed, stewed greens from his garden, barley, flatbread with honey glaze, if lucky. Cooking methods were simple. Open hearth fires, clay or bronze potstone ovens shared in veteran colonies. Food became familiar but flexibly a bridge between his Roman past and his local present. A cookbook survives from late antiquity, De Re Coquinaria, on the art of cooking, attributed to a peak. It likely wasn't used by common soldiers, but the ideas filtered down. Sample recipes include lentils with coriander and vinegar boiled, cabbage with oil and cumin, barley stew with pork belly, fish sauce, scrambled eggs. Yes, really, veterans wouldn't have had the luxury of imported spices or delicate sauces, but they knew how to adapt. Modern reconstructions of soldier-style meals use chickpeas vinegar and herb salted fish or anchovy paste, honey as a rare sweetener, a favorite flavor profile. Sour and savory, a legacy of the vinegarage, pasca, and heavily salted meats. Even in retirement, preservation was essential. Veterans often smoked their own meats over low fires, dried herbs on rooftop racks, pickled vegetables in brine or vinegar. Jars stored grain in clay pots, sealed with lime plaster or pitch. Archaeological sites like Vindolanda show rows of food storage, amphorae charred, remains of barley and beans, burnt bread crusts in fire pits, fragments of salted fish bones. This wasn't a feast. It was strategic cooking designed for winter, for siege, or for a long walk home in retirement. Many Roman veterans married local women, raised mixed culture families, built small villas or simple farms, formed veteran communities, complete with markets and shared ovens. Meals shifted from rations to routine: morning porridge or leftover stew, midday bread, cheese, maybe dried fruit, evening a thicker meal, boiled meat, legumes, and greens. Holidays, Saturnalia, calends, local festivals were marked with roasted pork, honey, cakes, shared wine if available. Storytelling about army life. Food became a way to teach Roman identity to local children and a way to remember, despite their rural locations. Veteran settlements were often near trade routes. This meant occasional olive oil from Hispania, wine, amphorae from gulfish sauce, from the Black Syrah spices, or dates from the East. Veterans formed small cooperatives, pooling resources to buy food in bulk. Some even produced for export, farming grain or raising pigs for military supply lines still operating nearby. Their tables became microcosms of empire. local bread, Roman wine, provincial pickles, and foreign dreams. Even in old age, veterans often maintained military habits, eating at specific times, measuring out flour, using vinegar in every dish, organizing pantry items like a supply depot. There are letters fragmentary, but clear where old soldiers write to officials complaining about late grain deliveries, inaccurate weights from local markets, disrespect from new recruits. One veteran writes, "The new men do not cook their lentils. They waste the salt. They leave the pot scorched." The discipline of food stayed long after the sword was sheathed. Some veterans achieved modest wealth. Their tombs list titles like Veteran of the XX Legion, Breadmaker to the 3rd Cohort, Salt Officer of the Legion's Rear Guard. Grave goods often include drinking cup, soil flasks, small clay ovens, food offerings, bread, beans, onions. 1. Tomb inscription from Gaul reads, "Here lies Lucius Marcius. He fed his family and his brothers. He never wasted wine. He salted well." A life measured not just in battles, but in meals prepared and shared. The Roman soldier's legacy wasn't only inroads, forts, or victories. It lived on in regional stews passed down from campfire recipes, frontier bread baked with local grain, vinegar-heavy flavor of forgotten poscond. The descendants of Roman veterans who cooked their barley on foreign soil. Rome conquered through discipline, but it endured through daily repetition, stirring the pot, salting the pork, soaking the bread, and somewhere, buried under a ruined villa, there's still a clay pot holding the last of a soldier's flour. In the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, the city of Pompeii bustled with markets, taverns, temples, and bathhouses. But behind its colorful frescoes and marble facades, an entire economy stank literally of urine, sweat, and sulfur. And at the center of this unglamorous, essential world was the Phalanca, the Roman laundry. These weren't quaint washing services. They were loud, labor-intensive, smelly enterprises run by freedmen and staffed by slaves, who scrubbed the wealthy's garments with chemical precision and brute force. This is the story of how the laundry business powered status, survival, and sanitation in one of the most famous cities of the ancient world, a world scrubbed clean by the hands of the forgotten. A Phalanca was a Roman laundry shop, part factory, part sweatshop, part chemical lab. In Pompeii, at least 18 Phalanca have been identified, scattered across the city. The most famous is the Phalanca of Stephanus, preserved nearly intact. After the eruption of 79 CE, it contained stone vats sunk into the floor for soaking clothes, shredding basins where workers stomped garments, barefoot rinsing channels, and drying racks, a rear courtyard with a pressing station for finishing garments. Process was industrial and foul because the cleaning agent used was not soap but urine. Urine contains ammonia, powerful natural cleanser that dissolves oils and grease, breaks down organic stains, softens fabric, for reed agate was free, abundant, and chemically effective. Romans knew its value and collected it publicly. Urinals, urina receptacula, stood on street corners. People relieved themselves in them, and foolers later purchased the contents. By the 1st century CE, Emperor Vespasian even taxed urine collection, famously replying, "Pecunia non olet," money doesn't stink. In a typical laundry cycle, clothes were soaked in diluted urine. Slaves stomped the garments rhythmically. Items were rinsed in clean water. Some were bleached or redded. Garments were brushed, stretched, and pressed for delivery. this wasn't laundry. It was chemistry through labor. Most workers in a Fleneca were slaves or very poor, freedmen. Their daily duties included hauling heavy baskets of urine-soaked laundry-stirring garments in cold, foul-smelling liquid for hours hanging clothes in open courtyards under the sun. There were no gloves, no protective gear, and little relief. The ammonia in urine burned the eyes and throat, caused skin rashes, and ulcers created a nauseating stench that clung to hair and skin. Many fullers lived in on-site quarters, slept above their workstations, and died youngest, especially those with respiratory conditions or skin infections. Yet, Phalenicae were legal and respected businesses, and some slaves could eventually earn or be granted freedom through their labor. The clients were the elite wealthy citizens with expensive woolen togas, dyed silks, or ceremonial garments. Even basic tunics required reshaping after washing. Whitening treatments, stain removal, especially for wine, oil, or blood. Clothing was a status symbol in Rome. A clean, bright toga was a mark of civic dignity. Dirty or poorly maintained garments signaled poverty or laziness. Therefore, Phalenics served politicians preparing for public events, priests maintaining ritual purity, merchants needing respectability, brides, grooms, mourners, and actors' clothes were often delivered with instructions scratched into wax tablets or dictated to literate slaves. Some laundry had woven identification marks to prevent mix-ups. After cleaning, clothes were brushed with metal combs, sprinkled with chalk or clay powder to absorb oils, pressed under flat stones or wooden frames, perfumed with herbs, myrrh, or imported oils. Some Phalenici used sulfur vapor chambers to whiten tunic, stone rollers to smooth heavy cloaks, bronze mirrors to inspect color quality. The final product was folded, perfumed, and wrapped, often returned by a delivery slave. In a city like Pompeii, where image, smell, and presentation mattered, truer, cleaner made or broke your reputation. While smelly and humble, Phalenicae were social hubs. Customers came to chat with owners, inspect work, exchange. Gossip discussed fashion trends. Some fuller families became locally prominent. The Phalonica of Stephanus likely belonged to a freedman who gained wealth and social standing through the business. His name appears on political campaign graffiti, suggesting he sponsored candidates. Phalonica had patrons, trade associations, and even minor religious rituals, often dedicated to Minerva, goddess of crafts, or Hercules, symbolizing endurance. The laundry business was surprisingly profitable. Expenses included urine, unless collected illegally, water purchased from city fountains, clay, chalk, and imported perfume. Slave maintenance and food profits depended on number of clients, quality of cleaning, reputation, and speed. Some fullers expanded into dyeing and mending, reselling used garment stain removal for sacred robes or costumes. Elite families had personal fullers, but most preferred reliable neighborhood shops with guaranteed privacy and discretion. Yes, even in Pompeii, laundry was a discreet affair. In the grand frescoes of Pompeii, you won't see slaves stomping in buckets of urine, but they were their day and night scrubbing the city's fabric, cleaning the evidence of wealth, and keeping up the illusion of effortless elegance. But what did it mean to rise from the fulling trough? Could a slave or freedman in such a dirty trade ever become respectably or even powerful? The last section revealed the grimy, essential labor of Rome's laundry workers, the slaves who waded through ammonia-filled vats, their bodies absorbing the costs of cleanliness in a city obsessed with appearance. But not all who lived among the urine-soaked stones of the Phalanca remained trapped in servitude. In the fluid social world of Pompeii, even dirty hands could wash their way into status. This section explores the surprising upward mobility of foolers, the complex social attitudes toward the trade, and how some laundry workers transformed filth into fortune, if not respect. In Roman society, freedmen liberty occupied a unique position. Slaves. They could never hold public office, but they could own businesses, accumulate wealth, vote, marry, pass on property to children, and fooling was a trade that offered opportunity. Many Phalancae were owned and operated by freedmen, men who had once stomped cloth and now managed others. These former slaves had insider knowledge of the trade connections with elite clients. Competition from aristocrats who disdained dirty work. One such man may have been Lucius Veranius Hypsæus, who lived in Pompeii before the eruption. His name appears on a stone relief showing laundry tools, suggesting pride in his profession. Foolers could sponsor local games, temple renovations, or even election campaigns, securing political alliances for their sons. By the early empire, foolers had formed professional associations in many cities, guilds known as corpora. These guilds maintained records of members, set quality standards, forwarded funeral assistants, paid for public works, fountains, altars, benches, hosted religious festivals, often dedicated to Minerva. While the state didn't grant them political power, guilds wielded influence in local affairs, especially in cities like Ostia, Rome, and Pompeii, where laundry was central to daily life. In some areas, guild heads, principals, wore distinctive dress and were honored with statues and inscriptions. Their trade might have stunk, but their reach didn't. Rome had a complicated relationship with foolers. They were needed for hygiene and status, feared for their association with bodily waste, mocked in poems and jokes, respected. When wealthy and generous satirists like Juvenal and Martial targeted foolers for easy laughs, he reeked of vinegar and piss, but sat front row at the theater. Yet inscriptions on tombs and shop fronts tell another story of pride, piety, and public service. One epitaph from Pompeii reads, "To Marcus Vibius Ampliatus, fuller and faithful friend, he gave freely, worked honestly, and rose with no shame. Clean hands meant wealth, dirty ones meant labor." Foolers straddled that line with pragmatic dignity. The Phalanca of Stephanus, one of Pompeii's largest, is notable not just for its vats and basins, but for its artwork. Its walls featured images of wool combing and pressing, paintings of garments being cleaned and dried, mythological scenes to impress or distract visitors. These murals served as advertisements. They told clients, "We know what we're doing. Our process is professional. You can trust us with your clothes." Archaeologists believe this Phalanca was part of a chain of properties, possibly managed by a freedman turned entrepreneur. Its prominence near the city center suggests status through soap and sweat. Foolers weren't judged by elegance, but by efficiency, discretion, consistency, results. A wealthy senator wouldn't care about your pedigree, but he'd remember if you lost. His ceremonial togaroand The purple dye gossiped about stains best left unmentioned, so successful foolers cultivated quiet loyalty, reliable schedules, affordable pricing, tiers quick turnaround times. Some even employed runners or messengers to update high-value clients on garment status. Imagine a slave delivering a wax tablet. Your toga will be ready tomorrow. The wine stain has faded. We await your approval. This was customer service, Roman-style. With success came options. Wealthy foolers could marry into lower-tier elite families. In real estate, host banquets for civic events commission, family, tombs and temples. The boundaries of class were porous in cities like Pompeii. Money, especially well-invested money, could smooth over dirty origins. One fuller's tomb near Naples reads, "Freedman, husband, citizen." He cleaned not just garments, but his name. Some fullers had children who became minor magistrates, officers, priests of local cults. The family name would live on, but the trade that built it would quietly fade from the story. By the time of the eruption in 79 CE, fullers were everywhere, economically vital, socially ambiguous, quietly indispensable. Their tools, urine jugs, pressing stones, chalk powder, were mundane, but their effect was transformative. They turned stained, wrinkled, common cloth into symbols of respect, class, and power. And some foolers, by persistence, did the same for themselves. The story of the Roman laundry slave is not just one of labor and stench. It is a story of economic leverage, quiet ambition, and dignity won through repetition. From the lowest trough, some climbed not to the Senate, but to a cleaner life, a name on a stone, and a business that outlived empires. But what happened to Fullenac when the ash fell? How did the eruption preserve their story? And what did the ruins reveal about life on the final day? We've followed the fullers of Pompeii from the urine vats of labor to the stone tombs of hard-earned respectability. But as the laundry basins cooled and the city prepared for another day of bustling commerce, something stirred under the earth. It was 79 CE, and time was running out. This final section examines what the ruins of Pompeii's Fullenac reveal about daily life at the very end, the last working day before the ash came. It also reflects on what has survived: the buildings, the tools, the footprints, and the ghost of labor, preserved in stone. The day began like many others in the Fullenaca of Stephanos and dozens of smaller laundries. Workers opened the courtyard. Shutters, water jugs were filled from nearby fountains. Clothes were sorted by owner or type. Treating vats where prepped slaves stepped barefoot into cold, ammonialist basins. Nearby shops set up market stalls. Patrons picked up clean togas. Scribes passed by with ink-stained fingers. The city was alive. There were no warning bells, not yet, just the smell of vinegar, clay, and sweat. The eruption of Vesuvius lasted about 18 hours. It began with a Plinian column, ash, pumice, and rock hurled into the sky. The next morning came pyroclastic surges, superheated clouds of gas and ash that swept down the mountain, incinerating everything in their path. But before death came preservation. In the Fullenac, archaeologists found vats still filled with partially cleaned garments' footprints. In the tread basins, some mid-step unfinished laundry orders, etched in wax tablets, charred garments, half-pressed and folded skeletal remains in corners, likely of slaves unable to flee at Stephanos Fullenaca. The pressing room was buried under tiles. In the treading room, the vats were intact except for the final splash of cloth hanging over the edge. It was as if someone had just stepped away. The most surprising detail: the chemical residue tests on the stone vats revealed high concentrations of ammonia, traces of uric acid, layers of calcium deposits from hundreds of washes. In essence, the Follinica weren't just architecturally preserved. We know what they touched. We even know what they smelled like. Pompeii is often remembered for its villas, frescoes, and wine jugs, but the Follinica tell a different story, that of sweat, stains, and survival in one laundry. A near-complete purple-dyed tunic was found. Purple dye from Tyrian murex snails was incredibly expensive, reserved for the elite, often a mark of senatorial status or priestly office. The tunic had been washed, lightly pressed, but not yet perfumed or folded. Its placement in the pressing room suggests it was nearly ready for pickup, likely to be worn at an event that never came. That tunic became a metaphor. An empire paused, an economy frozen in mid-task, an invisible worker caught between duty and death. In addition to laundries, Pompeii had dozens of public baths, robust sewer system, though patchy, privies attached to homes and shops, aqueducts that fed fountains and laundry basins. The interconnectedness of hygiene systems meant that when the eruption occurred, froze too. Archaeologists found interrupted water flow in plumbing systems, cracked aqueduct tiles filled with ash latrines mid-use, buried before flushing. The laundry industry wasn't isolated. It was part of a wider web of cleanliness and commerce. Its collapse marked a civic rupture, not just a commercial one. After the eruption, Pompeii was abandoned. Attempts to dig out valuables occurred sporadically, but the city slowly slipped from memory. Centuries later, when excavations began in the 18th century, the Follinica were dismissed by early antiquarians as unimportant structures. They wanted temples, statues, gold. But 20th and 21st century archaeologists understood differently now. Follinica are studied as evidence of urban labor sites, of industrial chemistry, microcosms of Roman class tension, proof of the lives of the enslaved. And invisible they've become classrooms for Roman economic historians, studying ancient detergents, anthropologists, reconstructing daily life. In one corner of a lesser-known Pompeii street, a worn statue base bears a partial inscription to Flavius Dama, freedman and fuller, who served the city with clean hands and clear heart. It's unclear if the statue stood above his tomb, his shop, or a fountain he paid for. The rest of the text is eroded, but the name remains. And so does the trade. Flavius Domalong, dead still, washes history clean with his legacy. The fullers of Pompeii weren't heroes or aristocrats. They didn't lead armies or pen epics, but they kept the city presentable, the garments white, and the egos inflated. They labored in filth so others could shine, and in the end, they were frozen mid-step, with a cloth in one hand and a burden in the other, not glorious, not grand, but immortalized in their ordinarines. So the next time you wash a shirt, scrub a stain, or fold laundry on a quiet evening, remember, you're continuing a task that once stood at the heart of a Roman city, now silent beneath the ash. Medieval history often centers on kings, knights, and castles. But kingdoms are not built on chivalry. They are carved, heaved, and flooded into being by people who remain nameless in stone, but loud in labor. This is the story of the ditch digger, the peasant with a shovel, a bent back, and a daily goal, measured not in glory, but in feet of sod turned and water redirected, whether draining swamps, digging castle moats, or laying out field boundaries. The ditch digger shaped the literal bones of medieval Europe, one scoop of earth at a time. It is the year 1284. You are a laborer on the outskirts of Norwich in eastern England. You do not own land, but with the right to move and sell your labor. The manor bell rings before sunrise. You rise from a straw mat in a wattle and daub hut, with smoke-blackened walls and the smell of damp wool in the air. There is no breakfast, just a piece of coarse rye bread, maybe dipped in small beer, a weak ale, or a mouthful of cold porridge. Then you walk a half-mile to the site, the drainage ditch at the edge of the manor's grain field. It is late autumn, and the soil is soaked. The cold air sticks to your lungs. The sky is low with clouds. You grip your wooden spade and begin dot to modern ears. Ditch may sound unimpressive, but in the medieval world, it was infrastructure as essential as the roads of Rome. Ditches were used to drain water from fields, demarcate property lines, feed fish ponds, divert waste or runoff, encircle monasteries, towns, or manors, form moats for castles, and fortified homes. Some ditches became permanent features, lined with stone or palisades. Others were seasonal trenches, dug and refilled yearly. Digging ditches wasn't merely about moving dirt, it was about controlling nature in a world where flooding, swamp fever, or erosion could ruin a village. The ditch digger had few tools: a wooden spade, sometimes tipped with iron, a mattock, a kind of heavy hoe for breaking clay, a pickaxe if stones or roots were present, a basket or wheelbarrow for hauling spoil, no gloves, no boots, just rough wool tunic, hose, and leather shoes. Hands blistered quickly, spades snapped often, mud clung to every seam, and in wet seasons the work never truly dried. Later in the day, ox carts might come to haul away excess soil, but until then, the digger worked alone or in a team of 3 to 5, each assigned a length to finish by sundown. Ironically, the ditch digger worked with and against water. Too much, and the trench collapses. Too little, and the ground becomes unyielding clay. The ideal soil is damp but firm, but it rarely cooperates to control water flow. Ditches were angled with subtle gradients, measured not with instruments, but by string lines, weighted reeds, and experience. A master ditch digger could read soil texture by foot drainage, angle by eye, water speed by sound mistakes, meant poor crop yields, rotting roots, angry landowners, fines from the reeve, the local estate manager. Around noon, you stop to eat. There is no break room. You sit on a stone or in the grass. You unwrap a crust of barley bread, small cheese, round day, raw onion, maybe a piece of salted pork. If the household had slaughtered recently, you drink small beer or water from a leather flask, knowing it may not be clean. Is little conversation. Everyone is tired. The sound of shovels becomes rhythmic, like breathing, like penance. Work is measured in rods and perches, units of medieval length. A lord might assign one perch of ditch, 4 feet wide, 2 feet deep by day's end. It sounds small, but with heavy soil and poor tools, it's backbreaking. The reeve inspects at dusk. Is the ditch straight? Is the depth consistent? Has the spoil been properly banked? Mistakes mean lost pay, or worse, assigned to night mucking duties, cleaning latrines or clearing waste pits. A well-dug ditch earns a halfpenny, maybe a penny on a good day, enough for bread, ale, and perhaps a candle or spoon at week's end.